Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I suppose I should continue in the theme of midwifery began by Liam MacArthur as I began this report and inquiry in Aviemore in 2007, and then a very interesting study visit to East Lothian, and then a committee meeting in Melrose just before I went on maternity leave last September, only to find myself returning in April to find that the committee report was still ongoing. Now that's what you call an inquiry. And as the convener has already said, it began in very different economic conditions from the one in which it finished. However, the key issues remain. How do you ensure the supply of affordable housing, both to buy and to rent in rural Scotland? The availability of affordable housing to rent was one that the committee faced, I think, time and time again as we went round Scotland. And I think the pressures, it would be fair to say, in different parts of Scotland were different. The pressures in East Lothian are very different from the pressures in Arran. The commuter belt for Edinburgh has very much influenced the supply of housing in East Lothian. But one of the things that was common to them all is that demand invariably outstrips supply. As the report went on, one of the real tensions we faced was that of housing allocation policy, and others have mentioned it. And it is one of those difficult issues. But whether real or imagined, a perception certainly exists that the current homelessness legislation is discriminating against people who have been brought up in a local community, who want to get a house of their own, maybe move out of the family home, and are not able to reach the top of the list in a timescale that's acceptable to them. Older people, there are also cases brought to us of older people wanting to move from the larger home that they had lived in when their children were there to a smaller home, but again, the legislation did not allow that to happen easily. I know from many examples in my own caseload that that's true in Clydesdale as it is in other parts of Scotland. I'm sure others are the same. I certainly don't want to do anything that runs in the face of tackling homelessness. But if we're serious about ensuring the sustainability of rural communities, we must find ways of enabling local people to find their way into the socially rented sector. And I hope the Minister will begin to look at that as the housing bill comes forward. The difficulty of developing sustainable rural communities is also compounded by the apparent unwillingness, I found, of developers to build genuinely affordable housing in rural Scotland. With average earnings in rural Scotland below those in other parts of the country, is it not perverse that most houses that we found being built during the course of the inquiry were too big and too expensive to be affordable to the people who worked in rural Scotland? And when you asked developers, when you quizzed them about that, it was everybody's fault but theirs. And they came forward with various excuses, indeed blamed local authorities who said they had openly discouraged the development of affordable housing to buy, but couldn't then come up with the evidence to support that allegation. The truth is that it was greed, that the larger house was able to be sold, you got more for that house, you made more profit, and therefore why bother with a two-bedroom £75,000 house that the man who works in the wee farm down the road might actually be able to afford, or the woman who works in the factory might be able to afford on her earnings. The thing about that kind of housing is that bought housing then becomes the prevail of the rich, who then don't want anybody else to live in the nice housing area that they've just bought. And it builds up resentment in the local community, and it leads to difficulties when further housing is planned. And so I do hope that as the housing market picks up, that the developers will learn from the mistakes that have been made in the past, and that we do build genuinely mixed communities, where people who earn the average earnings in Scotland are able to get a mortgage that they can afford in the long term, not just in the good times, and the house that they live in will be the one that they are able to stay in. Can I also pick up on the proposed changes to HAG? There is a problem. I think it is accepted by backbench members across the chamber, and the examples given by Liam MacArthur are not unique to Orkney. They are reflected across rural Scotland, indeed in my own constituency of Clydesdale, where RSLs who operate there are finding it increasingly difficult to make new projects stack up at a time when demand is increasing. I am sure the Minister does not have his eyes closed. I know from him and his record what he's about, and he doesn't want to stifle the ability of rural RSLs to meet the needs of the communities they serve. And I do hope that he will be able to come back to the committee at some point in the future with a review of this issue and provide a more positive framework for the future. Can I finally, Presiding Officer, deal quickly with the issue of compulsory purchase, and perhaps in a slightly different angle from others. But what I have found, and how we use compulsory purchase, but what we find in some parts of rural Scotland is that land is simply being allowed, or indeed dwellings are simply being allowed to fall into disrepair, either because the owner simply doesn't care, or is holding out for a better day. And what happens is that some local communities now have to live with the blight of a building that's falling down round about them, that could be providing housing to people who want it. And that's certainly true in communities such as Carnwath and Rigside in my own constituency, where there are such buildings. And I would ask the Minister to, perhaps with his colleagues, look at how that can be better done and how better advice can be given to local authorities as to how they can use the compulsory purchase powers that they have, along with social RSLs, to ensure that those sites can be developed for the positive benefit of communities, rather than just acting as a blight on development, a blight on that community, and stopping perhaps other developers working in and around that area because of the landscape that they find when they first come in. With those comments, Convener, can I commend the report to the Chamber and hope that it will all go through at decision time.